Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 221. And this is for our class for Monday, the 3rd, where we are continuing with our introduction to Shakespeare. And over the last couple classes, I had you respond to some attendance questions. So now that hopefully everyone has taken care of dropping and adding and so forth, I can respond to those questions. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are um, certainly not in any way prevented from doing so. You're encouraged to do so. But you are required to read their responses and what will be my responses in turn. And in terms of introductions, I'd like to introduce myself. And my introduction is that I was born and raised in New York City, and I attended college in upstate New York, University of Rochester, a school that advertised itself as a place where students could experience real winters. Little did I know what I was getting into. I thought that sounded quite exotic. And it was, I suppose. But there I am in Rochester, majoring in English, minoring in psychology, because I'm absolutely certain I'm going to be a lawyer, which goes to show how things change when you're in school. I took a Shakespeare class that really changed everything, and I realized that instead of going to law school, I would go to graduate school so that I could focus on Shakespeare and his contemporaries. But this time in a warm climate, because I'd had enough of real winters. So I settled on Southern California, UCLA to be exact, where I specialized in Shakespeare and his contemporaries, and eventually graduated, began my teaching career, realized that I was missing winter after all. So I began applying for positions on the East Coast, and a little school by the name of Greenfield Community College asked me out for an interview. So you know how this story ends. I came out for an interview in the summer of 1993. It's been that long. And we talked a bit about what my transition from sunny California might be like. But I was assured that the winters here in Massachusetts are not that bad. And when I began in the 93-94 year, it was a historical year in terms of weather because it was one of the worst recorded winters in Massachusetts history for snow and ice. So I was definitely in for a surprise. But I've been here ever since. And as I indicated, I teach a lot of eclectic things. So in addition to English classes, I also teach personal communication skills, public speaking, and yes, even a class in horror film. So, what I did last class was I had you view some videos about Shakespeare's biography and some of the theories about whether or not Shakespeare could have indeed been a pseudonym or some sort of ruse for another person. And this is called the authorship question. And if you're curious about my perspective, I believe Shakespeare was Shakespeare. I think it's hard to quantify genius. So the idea that Shakespeare didn't attend a formal college, I don't think is in any way valid because ultimately you can't teach genius. And certainly record keeping wasn't what it is today. So the fact that we don't have many records about Shakespeare, though I must admit that we had records about other of Shakespearean contemporaries. And while Shakespeare certainly referenced the court, I think that his knowledge is more broad than it happens to be specific, and that he is more of a generalist when he mentions matters of court and politics and so forth. And certainly, until more evidence is unearthed one way or another, we'll never know definitively. But most serious scholars believe that Shakespeare was Shakespeare. And that usually leads to the question of if we don't necessarily know who Shakespeare is. I mean, even his name was spelled differently on the few authenticated documents we have. But again, spelling was not standardized at the time. So individuals could spell even their own names in different ways. At least we've got the plays themselves. But if you were to look at the notes below under the third section, you'll see that there are also questions about the plays. Because at the time, playwriting and play acting really wasn't very respected. So they didn't have the kind of copyright system, certainly that we do today. So if you wanted to get a hold of a printed version of a play, you would have to get an unauthorized version. And these are known as quartos. This is a printing term in which you fold a large sheet of paper twice so that you get 4 leaves or 4 sheets. So for instance, you would fold it once, like thus, but then fold it again so that it almost looks like a paperback book, if you will. And those were unauthorized versions that were created either by bit actors in the company who were hired to try to recreate the plays. And I can only imagine the number of errors that would be in there, especially because actors usually learn their roles, but not necessarily the other roles. And an actor might perhaps remember their role as being a bit more important or grandiose than it was. Or individuals could hire someone to go watch a Shakespearean play and transcribe it while they're sitting in the audience. So there are lots of these versions of plays, of each of the plays that exist, and these are known as quartos, these unauthorized versions. What happened that was unusual is that 7 years after Shakespeare's death, his contemporaries got together and they wanted to put together a definitive version of Shakespeare's plays. Again, Shakespeare wasn't there to authorize this. But what they did was they put together something called a folio, another printer term where you have a large sheet of paper. This time you fold it just once rather than twice. So it's much larger. And then what contemporary editors do is that they put all the different folio, or they put all the different quarto versions that exist of a play, let's say Midsummer, next to the folio version that exists of a play, let's say Midsummer, and they try to the best of their ability to recreate what Shakespeare would have written at the time. But even that leads to some question marks. There are some of Shakespeare's plays that are known as problem plays because they're just that, they're problems. There are so many contradictions in the quartos and the folios that ultimately these are the plays that usually aren't studied at the undergraduate level. And even the plays that are considered to be clean plays that are studied at the undergraduate level can have some dispute with them. So if you're ever reading a Shakespearean play and you were to see, let's say, a square bracket in the dialogue of a Shakespearean play, and if you think about what a square bracket means in terms of writing, that a square bracket is an assertion from someone into a quotation. So the square bracket, if you ever see that in any of Shakespeare's plays, is basically an editor's insertion of their best guess as to what word would be appropriate based on context, the quartos and the folios. And because spelling and definitions weren't standardized at the time, Shakespeare created language, and sometimes some of those words were never used again. Occasionally, you might get a definition of a word, and when you go to your footnote, you'll see that there's a question mark before or after the definition. That is the editor's best guess as to what that word would mean in the context and time period. So, that said, the plays themselves can also lead to questions, but we assume that the plays, for the most part, followed different genres or kinds of writing. The comedies, which scholars believe were the earlier plays that Shakespeare wrote. Not that he necessarily wrote all the plays in chronological order, and in fact, we're not even certain of the dates of the plays. Heck, we're not even certain of Shakespeare's appearance. The portraits we have of Shakespeare are from after his death. So there are lots of question marks about Shakespeare. But if you ever see a C next to a date for a Shakespearean play, that means circa, that means around. So they're not necessarily sure of the dates. But we think that Shakespeare wrote the comedies during the earlier part of his career. These are usually more lighthearted plays where there is no death. And for a comedy to be considered a comedy, yes, there should be some humor, but more importantly, it should be about love and its mix-ups. And at the end, there should either be marriage or the promise of marriage. There would also be lots of music and dance. They were very celebratory. You might not necessarily get that sense just by reading a play, all the music and dance involved. And it's thought that the comedies were oftentimes performed either immediately before or after a wedding. So that would be an appropriate tone for a play, either before or after a wedding. And we're going to begin with Shakespeare's comedies in the semester because we think that Shakespeare would have devoted the early part of his career mostly to comedies. And then we think that Shakespeare moved on to histories. And these are plays that are loosely based on British history, not world history, British history. So you couldn't say something like Antony and Cleopatra is a history play because it isn't about British history. There was a history book at the time. It was called The Chronicles of Holinshed that Shakespeare and everyone would have used as the definitive version of the history. So knowing the history of the time period is very useful because these are plays that will talk about past rulers, kings for instance, and part of the purpose of the play was to invoke patriotic feelings about England's past, its present, and its probable future. The thing with the history plays is that Shakespeare took dramatic liberties. So sometimes knowing the history can actually be detrimental to you because you expect the play to be accurate to history, and it's not. And Shakespeare would have taken dramatic liberties. And the history plays, in some ways, kind of anticipate the tragedies. And the tragedies are probably what Shakespeare is best known for. Those were the plays that we believe Shakespeare basically concentrated on after the histories. And this would have been around the time of Shakespeare's son's death, his son Hamnet. Perhaps not a surprise that Shakespeare wrote a tragedy called Hamlet. The names sound very similar in this instance. About a great man who experiences downfall. And the downfall occurs because of outside forces, but also because of flaws in character. And if this sounds familiar to you, this tradition was established in Greek drama with the Oedipus the King trilogy, specifically the first Oedipus the King. And of course, Shakespeare would have taken some liberties with that because Shakespeare always took liberties with things. But if you think about how different the tragedies are from the, let's say, comedies, look at the titles, where the tragedies are named after individuals, such as King Lear or Othello or Macbeth. And the comedies usually aren't named after any characters at all. For instance, A Midsummer Night's Dream or Much Ado About Nothing. We think that Shakespeare ended his career before he retired by writing in a genre called tragic comedies. So they would be much darker than what you would expect in a comedy. Expect lots of death and despair in the tragedies. But they would end happily with either marriage or the promise of marriage. So that would be the comedic aspect of these plays. And we are going to be reading representative plays from all of these genres so that we could talk about these genres in more depth as the semester progresses. The thing is that Shakespeare oftentimes had to contend with plague, and his society had to contend with plague, where the theater houses would be closed down because it was feared that plague was spread through some sort of airborne respiratory illness. It's spread by fleas, actually, on rats, for instance. But nevertheless, when the theaters were closed, sometimes months at a time, this is where we think Shakespeare concentrated on his poetry writing, which are known as sonnets. And this is how we are going to begin the semester, by reading some representative sonnets. These are highly structured poems, but they give you an idea of Shakespeare's perhaps brilliance, because he was able to keep to all those structural rules, yet be able to do some things that were pretty creative. And also, we will be introduced to some of Shakespearean language at the time of Shakespeare, so that ultimately, hopefully, we can begin to get a sense of some of the rhythms. What you can expect in a sonnet, because it was so structured, is 14 lines, always. A rhyme scheme or a rhyme pattern where you look at the rhyme of the words of the ending of each line, and you identify those rhymes through letters of the alphabet, A being the first letter. Anything that rhymes with that sound would be identified as an A. And then any word that ends a line that rhymes with a new rhyme would be identified as the B rhyme. They all rhyme together until we got to yet another rhyme, and then that would be C. And then anything that rhymes with the C would be identified in that way. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the sonnets. But the pattern of the rhyme in Shakespeare's sonnets would be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Last two lines would rhyme together. That would be a couplet, would serve as a kind of summary. So when you're reading the sonnet, you might want to test this. Are the sonnets 14 lines? And you'll see yes. And do they have that rhyme scheme of A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G? And the answer is yes. And are they about important enough themes to write a sonnet about? Not the ordinary, not the common, but things like love and death, and these themes that are considered to be lofty. And they would also have a particular rhyme scheme, or I should say a rhythm or a rhyme, or they would have a particular meter or a rhythm associated with them as well. Iambic pentameter, the syllable line that sounds like ba-bum, 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 bum-bum, almost like a heartbeat. And some people have argued that's why Shakespeare is so popular, because it sounds like a heartbeat. And so it's a very familiar sound, probably the first sound we all heard when we were in our mother's wombs. For the plays, you can also expect a certain level of structure, 5 acts. And in the first act, we're introduced to characters. In the second act, we begin to have a building of tension. The third act is the height of tension. The fourth act is the beginning of resolution. The fifth act is resolution. It's often portrayed as a triangle or a pyramid, where the first act is on the lower left-hand side, and then the second act is the beginning of the rising on the left-hand side, and the third act would be the point or the pinnacle of the triangle, the height of conflict. And then the fourth act would be the beginning of descent on the right-hand side, and then the fifth act would be the ending of the pyramid or the point. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this as the semester progresses. But what I wanted to do is to talk about the theaters, because ultimately the theaters will influence things like how these plays were performed. And the theaters were places for entertainment, but also for intellectual stimulation. They were the theater of the day, and you could expect all levels of audience, from the rich and the poor, from the young and the old, from royalty to labor, and of course, the more money you had, the better seats you could buy. If you didn't have much money at all, you wouldn't be able to buy a seat, but you could buy entrance into the play and stand in front of the stage. And you were known as a groundling if you did that, or a stinkard. Hygiene left much to be desired during that time. And this all begins with medieval theater. When I think about English medieval theater, where they would have traveling wagons and tell biblical stories, not necessarily very efficient for collecting fees, which is why permanent theaters were built, and then the audience would travel to the theater rather than the actors traveling to the audience in these wagons. And probably the best known theater of the time period is Shakespeare's theater, the Globe Theater. And the first, it's a circular O. It's made out of wood and joined together with wooden jointry and then plastered. And the first Globe actually burned to the ground. It had a thatched roof, and during the use of some special effects, the firing of a cannon, it caught the roof on fire and the Globe burned down. They rebuilt the Globe, this time with a tile roof, so that it was more fireproof. And then ultimately, after Shakespeare's death, the Puritans, who were known for being a very strict religious sect, and they really viewed theater as evil. They had that theater torn down. Luckily for us, in the 1990s, an American, no less, came to visit the reconstructed Globe Theater, found that there was just a little placard there, and made it his lifelong mission to reconstruct that Globe Theater with the leading scholarship of the time. The man's name was Sam Wanamaker, and even though there was lots of skepticism, he was able to basically reconstruct the Globe Theater. Unfortunately, he didn't live long enough to see the first performance done in the Globe Theater or the reconstructed Globe Theater. But if you look in the notes below in the second section, you will see that I have included a link that is shakespearesglobe.com, where you can learn more about that Globe Theater, where they would have afternoon performances because they would have to take advantage of the light, where a colored flag would be flown outside the theater in order to advertise what kind of play would be showing. Black for tragedy, for instance, or white for comedy. In fact, theaters were so disdained that they weren't allowed to advertise in the city proper. And that said, the stage would have something like a trap door where actors could descend into hell or ascend onto the stage. There would be overhead stage machinery where you could have some special effects, some pulleys and ropes, things of that nature, so you could have a character ascend into heaven if you wanted to. Pretty minimal with the props on stage, but the costuming very elaborate because clothing at the time oftentimes denoted rank. So the fabrics you were able to wear, even the colors you were able to wear, would oftentimes indicate your station in life. And again, theater was viewed as rather unsavory and lowbrow, so it was assumed that someone of a superior station couldn't be involved in the theater, which is where a lot of the conspiracy theories come in with Shakespeare. Could Shakespeare have been someone in nobility, for instance, and who wasn't allowed to take credit for authoring these plays? And I suppose anything is possible, but the most common theory and the one that I ascribe to is that Shakespeare was indeed Shakespeare. Again, the idea that his contemporaries 7 years after his death would join to put together a folio was unprecedented at the time period. But if you want to get an idea what the globe looks like, again, in the second section in the notes below, you will see that I've included a link, shakespeareglobe.com, Discover About Us virtual tour. So you can at least take a virtual tour what the globe looks like. If you're ever on campus, come visit my office because I have a model of the reconstructed Globe Theater in miniature that actually my husband built for me. Since it's been built, there's been some dispute about some of the elements of the theater. Many of the actors say that they feel that the stage is too large and unwieldy. I can say that regardless, audiences love productions there, and the hottest seat in town, so to speak, is to be a groundling, because the irony is that while you are exposed to the elements because you're standing next to the stage, as opposed to being in the covered area with the seats, you perhaps have the best view because you're right up front, so you're really able to appreciate some of what's going on. And my hope is to be able to show you a production from Shakespeare's Globe Theater when we view A Midsummer Night's Dream, a production that was filmed in that reconstructed globe, so that you can get a sense of some of the ways that the theater might influence the production of the plays themselves. We also think there were perhaps some smaller indoor theaters, one by the name of Blackfriars, for instance, for the very wealthy. The good news is that even though theater was seen as lowbrow, Queen Elizabeth loved the theater. And that's one of the reasons why probably the theater existed, because she was supportive of it. She was a patron of the arts. Renaissance means rebirth, renewal. She very much supported the arts. And if she were present, probably what she would do is sit on the stage itself. And my suspicion is that audiences would behave themselves, because ultimately those theater audiences could be pretty rowdy. Think of a football game, if you will. They would be yelling. They would be throwing food if they didn't like what they saw on stage. Rotten fruit, for instance. The theaters were known as a place for prostitutes and pickpockets, so it was kind of unsavory area. And the time period did have a censor. He was known as the Master of Revels. And what was mostly censored was politics. It was a fairly open time in terms of sexuality and violence, but much more conservative with politics. Saying the wrong thing could get you into big trouble with the queen. So, that said, Shakespeare oftentimes made political commentary, but it was buried in his plays. So, that's one of the things we'll see in his plays is that they have multiple levels. Remember, all levels of society would have gone to view these particular plays. And there was even a theory at the time called the chain of being, that everything was ranked, everything had a hierarchy. God was at the top, and then the angels would follow, and then the humans, and man above woman, and adult before child, and rich before poor. In some ways, very similar to today's hierarchies that we have. And Shakespeare questions this chain of being, but again, this was a political issue, so he couldn't outwardly question it. He might question it perhaps with having characters who were higher level characters experience dissent. And the idea is if you were a higher level character, you were speaking in poetry. So if you've got a higher level character who now is speaking in prose in complete sentences, this could be an example of dissent. And the exact opposite could be that you've got a lower level character who's supposed to be speaking in prose, complete sentences, but then they begin speaking in poetry. And that could show that just because you're born into a particular position, that doesn't mean that you can't improve your situation. So, in terms of the queen, she was known as the Virgin Queen because she did not marry. And that, I think, was important to allow her to maintain her level of power. And that said, when she was getting older, there was lots of concern about who would be the next ruler because there was no direct heir because she didn't have children. This is something that will become important when we start reading some of Shakespeare's later plays, and Elizabeth is getting older, and this is a question on everyone's minds. But again, it's something that you really wouldn't talk about because political discussion could get you into quite a bit of trouble. And if you are thinking about the idea of some of the challenges of Shakespeare's language, which I know that oftentimes is a concern, do read the language out loud because a lot of times you can hear rhythms. There was a lack of standardization at the time, so things like spelling hadn't been standardized, definitions hadn't been standardized, meanings have changed over time. So, for instance, the word die, D-I-E, in our time, which means the ending of life, or perhaps it could be the singular of dice. In Shakespeare's time, die meant orgasm. So, in other words, it was sexual. So, having a character say something to the effect of "I die upon your lap" could have a sexual meaning. And I don't know if a contemporary audience would have necessarily realized that without someone drawing their attention to it. So language is different during Shakespeare's time. And the thing is that we think that Shakespeare's pronunciation would be different too. So if you're looking at the 5th section now, which is entitled Renaissance Language in the notes below, I have a short video for you to watch of about 10 minutes or so, where it talks about how they believe pronunciation changed during Shakespeare's time and what the plays would have sounded like. So there's sometimes while we're reading Shakespeare's plays, well, we might not notice a particular rhyme, in part because we pronounce words differently. And once you know the plot, it's certainly so much easier to be able to understand the language and to be able to appreciate it. And in order to emphasize that point, I wanted to draw your attention to, in the Renaissance language, the section Contemporary versus Renaissance Language, Branyan, 8 minutes. And I think you'll find that it's a story that you've heard of before in our contemporary language, but it has been adapted into Shakespearean language. And hopefully it's something that can amuse you and entertain you. And I don't want to give away too many spoilers, so I'll just leave it at that. So, read out loud, try to paraphrase, put in your own words, reread things, identify themes, and examine what's happening with the language, which is what I'm going to be talking about next class when we're talking about sonnets. So you can see that I've included links for the 6 sonnets that we are going to be reading: 15, 18 and 20, 127, 130, and 151. I've also included a link for Midsummer Night's Dream, which happens to be our first play. And hopefully you can begin reading that sooner rather than later, because while we will have multiple classes devoted to Midsummer Night's Dream, my hope is that as we are talking about A Midsummer Night's Dream and also talking about papers, you are at home reading the next play, which is Much Ado About Nothing. So what's left is our class attendance question. So this would be due on Wednesday the 5th. Of course, if you need an extension, please let me know. I've talked quite a bit about Shakespeare, and you've seen several videos about Shakespeare. Thus far, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about Shakespeare? Thus far, what is the most interesting thing you've learned about Shakespeare? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Enjoy the 2 videos, and we will continue next class. Take care. Bye-bye.